Okay, everyone, I'm going to kick off. I think we're in the process of letting everybody in the room, and we're recording it. So just, this will be going out on YouTube later on. So welcome, everyone, this evening to the second of the autumn-winter programme of events being put on by Progress and Policy Network. My name is Nathan Yoel, and I'm the director of Progress and Labour to Win, and I'm chairing this session this evening. It was a no-brainer, really, it being an American presidential year, that we would definitely do an event on the American election. I think I was reading an old friend of mine, Adrian McMenamin, who some of you may know on here, wrote a post on Facebook a day or two after the election, trying to get down his feelings onto the page about why he felt so emotionally invested in this year's election, over and above the fact that we can now all watch CNN 24 hours a day, every day, and like I think most of us on this call, we probably did. But he went through and quite convincingly and said that basically off the back of 10 years of austerity in this country and 4 or 5 years of the rise of strongmen across Europe and America, the fact that Trump, the outrider for all these strong men movements, has been defeated and there is some hope again for politics in the United States, really helped to explain the emotion that basically seems to crash over the progressives, the centre and the left in Great Britain and across the globe. And I think virtually everyone on this call, I'd imagine, had a similar feeling. So because of that, we thought it would be really, really interesting and really important to convene a panel tonight to talk about our reflections on 2020 and to go over politics in America as it is, what the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as President and Vice President of the United States mean for the Democrats and for progressives in the United States, and also, crucially, over here in the UK and across Europe. So our three speakers this evening, in the order I'm going to ask them to speak, we've got Amanda Renteria. Amanda, I think, probably is best known over here for being the political director of the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. We also have Stefanie Brown-James. Stefanie is the co-founder of the Collective PAC and also was the Supremo for American African organizing for the Obama campaign in 2012. And then from these shores, we've got David Lammy, who most on this call will know as the MP for Tottenham and has made a return to the shadow cabinet, for which big thumbs up here, has made a return to the shadow cabinet as Shadow Secretary of State for Justice when Keir took over in April. So essentially, the way I'm going to run the meeting, David's got to go around about 7:30. So first off, we're going to ask the three speakers to give their opening remarks. They've probably got between 8 and 10 minutes to do this. We'll take Amanda, then Stefanie, and then David. Then we'll take questions from the chat function. As ever, we've received some questions already. They've all been from men. So what I want to see on tonight, I don't want to see any shy women questioners at tonight's meeting. Please put your questions in the chat function and you will definitely get called. So with that, Amanda, over to you.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. It's daytime here, but it's really great to be with you all. And in fact, I spent most of my election night actually with the election night team on BBC. And so I felt like I was actually experiencing this from the perspective and view of how people viewed America during this very interesting first 24 hours of the election. Of course, it's moved since then. But to back up, I just wanted to give you a little bit about myself so that you understand the context by which all of my comments come from. I was Hillary Clinton's national political director in 2016, and I've spent the majority of my career in public service, working at all levels of government, everywhere from the California Department of Justice under the current Attorney General when Trump came into office, to a local level city council in Silicon Valley. And so I've been able to really view the span of that. But personally, I'm also the daughter of immigrants from Mexico, and grew up in one of the most rural, low-income areas, actually one of the 10th poorest congressional districts in the country. So I do come with this very interesting perspective and different views of the places I've lived and now in politics, and really viewing public service and government as a way of really changing the world. Today, I'm also CEO of Code for America, that really partners with government on bringing technology to government in order to serve more people. So there are three different comments I have about election and the moment we're in America. Number one is really this overall sense of hope. So in those first 24 hours, everybody, I know all of my friends and everyone who was on air that night were pretty shocked at what seemed like a very, very, very close election. As time has now come through, what we are seeing of the final numbers is that the youth vote was higher than ever before. People of color were coming out in higher numbers than they ever have. We are seeing, we did see more rural voters come out than they ever had. And by the way, this is in the moment of a pandemic. And I can't express to you enough, being on the campaign side of things, that when logistics change, that generally means you lose thousands of voters, because there's been so much work to educate people on how to vote. This year, everything was brand new. And the fact that we actually had more people come out is a hopeful message. I think as the days and weeks have also come through, we are beginning to see that the story people initially thought would happen on election night is beginning to surface. It is true that people overwhelmingly chose Biden, and really didn't choose Trump is, I think, more to the point. That piece we're beginning to see in communities of color, in youth, in all kinds of different states around the country. The second piece that has really come over the course of 4 years, and I'm remembering from 2016 till now, is we've really had a reckoning in America about the clear-eyed reality of the challenges we face. Whether we're talking about racial injustice, whether we're talking about climate change, immigration, economic equality. Those have certainly surfaced, and I could give you a whole host of others. The reason this matters is because I think for most people who were politically engaged, or even not politically engaged, just watching politics from the outside, people said everything's going to be fine. Our government's fine. And the voices who said it wasn't fine were ignored, often pushed to the side. And what is now happening is all of that conversation and the discussion has really surfaced. And America has a clear-eyed view of the expansion, breadth of challenges we have to tackle. The third thing that is different in America and American politics today, partly due to COVID, but this overall sense of urgency. And you're seeing it literally today with announcements of cabinet secretaries, with the announcements of the national security team. What you are seeing is people understand that we've got to start this work now, that we're in it now, whether it's talking about figuring out a real plan to COVID, whether it's figuring out how to actually address climate change and get back into the Paris Accords, whether it is moving the team and having people in place, experience, who can go up that learning curve or who are already up that learning curve starting now. We have never seen this in American politics. I remember the transition teams when it was Clinton and Trump, and how much time was spent really trying to figure out, oh, we're going to be okay. Well, this will happen naturally. Right now, there's certainly a sense of urgency that the work starts now, and the ability to bring the country together starts now as well. And so as I think about how people might view America, I am left with feeling probably more hopeful as a kid that grew up in a place that often felt pretty left out from a Latino immigrant community that were often felt sidelined when it came to policies or leadership. Today, turning on TV and seeing diversity on that stage, seeing women, seeing Latinx, seeing Black leaders, seeing all the leaders we're seeing today now surface and become what will become our new leadership, with the mandate of the largest electorate in history voting, is a real hopeful message for what I see today. So it's with that I'm excited to be having this conversation, and with the awesome panel that I get to have this dialogue with. So thank you so much.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Amanda. So the two takeaways there, that it was people did not choose Trump. So it's nice to know that all our opinions over here were shared in America, and that Amanda feels hopeful. I think, Stefanie, moving on to you, do you feel that sense of hope as well?
Yeah, I actually do feel hopeful, and thank you all for convening this conversation, for even having an interest in what's happening in American politics. Because one thing we do know is that our global community is more interconnected than ever before, and so what happens in America, I know, is important to what happens in Britain, and vice versa, and around the globe. And so I'm happy to be a part of this conversation. I am definitely hopeful. I love being able to see the speed at which these cabinet picks are coming out. I think the Biden-Harris administration is now priding themselves on beating the Obama Biden transition by speed in which their cabinet picks are being announced. Also, the historic nature of their cabinet picks. To have a man that is Cuban born now head up the Department of Homeland Security to talk about how we really need to fix immigration in this country is something that should be applauded. To have a woman that is heading up the U.S. intelligence community should be applauded. And so these are not just quick picks. These are picks of a cabinet of people who have not only been in politics for a while, or not only been a part of the Biden political world for a while, but these are people who are experts at what they do. And I think that's really a sense of what we as Americans want to get back to, is to have people in the White House who are experts at what they do, that know the job from day one and are able to get to work, because there is a lot of work that is going to have to happen. As Amanda mentioned, I think now we are really starting to focus on what are the policies we need to see to progress our communities forward. I think historically in Joe Biden's acceptance speech, he talked specifically about how the Black community, for example, came out for him yet again. We all know that if it wasn't for Black voters in South Carolina during the primary, Joe Biden would not be where he is today. That was really the turning point, the primary election, for him to really speed vote forward towards the nomination for the Democratic Party and ultimately the presidency. Yet we know that Black people are going to hold his feet to the fire, just as all Americans are. We want to see now what are the policies that are going to happen. A lot of that depends on what happens in the U.S. Senate. We know that Congress is still undecided. There is a major Senate race for the runoff elections in Georgia, where both Senate races are in runoff situations, which is really historic. And so January 5th is another key date I hope everyone is paying attention to, because those two elections will decide how the United States Senate is shaped up, if Mitch McConnell will continue to have the power to, quite frankly, block progress from happening to empower communities across the country. The only thing I do want to say, just speaking specifically about voter turnout, yes, voters rejected Trump, and Biden is now our president, but we know that white voters actually doubled down on President Trump. In 2016, white men and women voted for Trump at 54%. They actually increased their support for Trump to 57%. White women increased their support after hearing the demagoguery, after hearing so many messages of division, so many messages, quite frankly, that were anti-women, anti-immigrant, anti-people of color. They doubled down, actually. And so we have a real issue in this country, a year in which we saw so much social unrest happen, where we thought we saw coalitions coming together, and we did. I don't want to diminish that we did see coalitions happen where people across economic lines, across racial lines, geographic lines stood up together to say systematic racism is a problem. However, you have a community of people of color, women, who are now looking at their neighbors differently to say, maybe you are the ones to say, I'm actually okay with the policies and the way the personalities of Donald Trump has been able to be. And I'm okay with that. And that is actually rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. So, once again, we saw young people of color turn out en masse for the Democratic Party. I think moving forward, we will continue to see people ask of more from the Democratic Party, which is going to be difficult, because this is a party that now is so broad, has expanded the tent so much that, when there's a lot of mouths to feed in the house, you got to figure out as a mama, what am I cooking today to make sure that everybody gets fed, but also understand that everybody has to be able to progress together. And so, yes, I am ultimately hopeful, but I do believe that What the election showed us is that there's a long road ahead of us when it comes to having the conversations around equity and justice and demolishing white supremacy in this country and around the globe, to be able to really have the policies in place and really be able to have the feeling of oneness in this country for people to come together moving forward.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Stefanie. David, over to you. And maybe if you actually like to give, obviously someone who has spent a lot of time in the States over the years and spent some time living there, can you give your reflections on what it means to you from personally, but then also actually what reflections you think we might be able to take as members of the Labour Party on this call?
Well, look, thank you very much. And thank you so much, Amanda and Stefanie, for joining us. I don't think I would be a member of Parliament. I probably wouldn't be the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice were it not for the 3 fantastic years I spent in the United States. Frankly, as someone from a minority that is only represented in 4% in the UK population, I drew so much from attending Harvard Law School, particularly from African American friends across the States, and from being in the States for 2 years after Harvard, working as a young lawyer. And I've got many, many friends in the Democrats, had many conversations over the last few days. And obviously, I, along with everybody else, zooming in, and most people in this country, with just the relief, the joy that seeing the back of Donald Trump is hard to express. And frankly, the tension and stress that so many of us felt because he was in the White House was tremendous. Of course, what I'm thinking about is what this means for us here and how we get a progressive government here in the UK, and what lessons we might draw from the United States, and what I think is more challenging for us. I mean, the first thing to say categorically is that we know that if you get 2 terms in America, you can sort of set a tone that affects much of the world. And, you know, Reagan and Thatcher worked in huge partnership and, if you like, set the tone for a super capitalist neoliberal model that was largely adopted across the globe. Blair Clinton, a third way in politics, was again copycatted all over the world. And the fear with Donald Trump getting a second term was not just what he would do to the United States, but it's what's then replicated in our own country and in so many places across the world. And so the fact that the American people halted that is just huge, not just for America, but for all of us. However, and there are some howevers, what we know is that the populist nationalism demonstrated in office by Donald Trump has not gone away. And in fact, even though he lost, as Stefanie has said, people turned out in bigger numbers to vote for him. And that is deeply, deeply disturbing. But it's not just disturbing because it was Donald Trump, but because at a period in which we, the global community, and certainly in our country, we are in recession, and that is likely to last for some significant time. History tells us that it's very, very likely that this tide of populist nationalism is not going to abate. And it's interesting to hear Amanda say that he's likely to stay around. And certainly the way that he has failed to kind of concede and give up office would suggest that he is deliberately stoking it so that his followers can believe that they were denied something that they can turn out again in 4 years' time for him or a member of his family. And so, and we see much of the playbook of Donald Trump replicated in this country. We see the culture wars. We see the attack on democratic norms, particularly in my area, justice and constitutional type arrangements. And so, you know, there's a lot to do for us to get to this point. We also recognize that the demographics, the demography of the United States is so fundamentally different from any European country, and certainly from ours here in the UK. Ethnic minorities make up 14% of the population. They can never deliver a political party to office. And I'm afraid if the white supremacist tones of Donald Trump garnered quite as many votes as it garnered, then that is deeply, deeply worrying for all progressives, and certainly for ethnic minority people such as I at this time, if that were deployed here. And we have seen that rhetoric. Largely in the UK, it's through a sort of anti-immigrant lens, and even actually under more moderate conservatives, David Cameron, Theresa May as Home Secretary, a lot of that playbook was deployed. There is a lot of sharing of ideas, and it's worrying. The misinformation, the conspiracy theories, the deliberate stoking is something that we will need to learn from and understand. It's my understanding from Democrats that there was a real understanding that this is not an election that could be won on Twitter. In fact, there was an ignoring of much that was posted on Twitter. It was won online, but sometimes folk confuse that with the bubble, because Twitter is absolutely a bubble in which certain kinds of people are at, but that's not where the election is won. Nevertheless, the misinformation, and it looks really interested to see what you say about this, Amanda, as if some of the saber rattling about Joe Biden's being a communist, socialist, in bed with Venezuelan dictators and Cubans and all sorts, did seem to play with some of those Latino votes. But I defer to you. But that's some of the read across that I have seen. So for us, the fact that the Democrats motivated young people to turn out, but were also able to mine and get votes from voters who traditionally don't turn out in elections, is a lesson that we can learn. And we saw actually in a few elections, in our 2017 elections, it was the case that people turned out who had not turned out before. And actually in the Scottish referendum vote, not for us, but for the SNP, we also saw people voting before that had not voted before. So gaining those votes but building on others is going to be very important. That then takes us to the suburbs and what happened in the suburbs. It's my understanding that there were certainly towns as opposed to cities that did not feel able to vote for Hillary Clinton that were switched on to voting for Biden. I'd want to understand a bit more about who those voters were and what flicked the switch. But that is going to be very important for us here in this country, because we have not traditionally been able to get the votes in the suburbs that certainly saw Tony Blair sweep into office. And I think there's something about listening to the concerns of people. However, it does appear to me that this election was very much a referendum on Trump, that there was a strategy that the Democrats had to turn the election into a referendum on Trump. From what I could see here in the UK, compared to other elections, and certainly compared out by Elizabeth Warren in the primaries, this was a policy light election. It felt like it was very tonal. It felt like a referenda. Unfortunately, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won that referenda. I wonder if that's instructive to us here. We went into our last election with a huge policy platform, some of which sadly was rejected by the electorate, some of which the electorate didn't understand, and some of which the electorate didn't want. There was a lot of discussion after that election, but the point is, actually, given the handling of coronavirus in this country, where we've seen more deaths than anywhere in Europe, given the handling of the economy, and we've got a double shock, not just Brexit, but also the pandemic recession, is the next election really a referendum? It may not be Boris Johnson as the candidate, but on the Conservatives. And is that instructive to us to learn from what the Democrats did? So those are my sort of initial reflections, but clearly Amanda and Stefanie are the lead items here.
What David said. I was going to ask some questions. We've actually had, whoopee, thankfully, a lot of traction in the chat comment and also people emailing me. So I've already sort of singled out, I think, 7 or 8 people, and I'm going to take them. I'm trying to group them so they make a certain amount of sense, but who knows what our viewers do. So Joseph, I'll take Monica Threlfall, then Sadie Trent, and then David Coates. So I think off the back of what David's just said about whether it's a referendum on the Conservatives, all 3 of them had questions, basically asking questions about the stubborn bedrock of Trump's support. And yes, it's right that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have got the biggest vote share or the biggest vote in American history, but President Trump has the 2nd largest vote in American history. And there is that fact about there is something there we need to sort of chip away at. So Joseph, I'll take Monica, then Sadie, then David, and chaps, if you can keep your questions brief, we can run through as many as possible. Thanks.
Yes. Oh, I'm speaking to blank screen. Can you see me, hear me?
We can hear you, Monica, yeah.
Oh, okay, all right, you're back. Yes, I've always been struck by this, that in 2016, there was a lot of comment about Trump even getting all these women, that he oughtn't to have got and so on. And then I later came across some small piece of research that said that the Trump support came far more from wives of Trump supporters than from single women. And I thought at the time, gosh, this really means something. There is a difference. But nobody was looking at it because the split was simply men, women, and nobody looked at married women. So I'm asking you, does anybody know about this? Because it's quite low key, but it's significant. Has anything come out that there's a, married women versus unmarried women split in Trump support?
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Monica. So Sadie, you're up next.
Yeah, my question is, why do people believe that like people in swing states, like key swing states such as Michigan, stuck with voting for Trump? Because I have family in places that had seen really bad deprivation, such as Flint. So I'm curious as to why people think that is. Obviously seeing the really bad discourse that Trump had been putting out into the American public.
Great, cheers, Sadie, thank you. Now, David, I know you've asked 3 questions in the chat. You can ask the first 2, and hopefully we'll come back to the 3rd one nearer the end of the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. Okay, well, I was pushing my luck a bit with 3 questions.
You've got 2, come on.
So the first question is prompted by what Stefanie said, really, which is, why did white voters double down on Trump in 2020? Why, when most people over here, including conservatives, find Trump completely loathsome, was he so appealing to whites in the US? And the second is, if Joe Biden's task, in addition to all the things that you've all talked about around climate change and the economy and COVID, is to reunite the country, how does he talk effectively to the 70 million people that voted for Trump?
Right, okay, so some quite chunky questions to work our way through. And actually, I'll take the speakers in the same order we took them. So Amanda, if you go first, then Stefanie, then David.
Okay. So on married women, it is something that every single campaign focuses on. You do often see a married women split versus single women. Some of that has to do with just the conservative nature of where we're seeing our married women, but also just single women are generally younger, more progressive. And we're seeing we're continuing to see those trends really throughout. It's hard for me when I think about all the analysis on, in general, women voters, because 2016 was so different than our midterms in 2018 and 2020. And in part, what happened in 2016 is you didn't have this major engagement in the way that you saw post-Trump. People were just simply not as fired up until they saw that Trump won, until they heard more of the misogyny. And I remember in 2016 how often we would hear on the campaign, that's just entertainment. It's a game. He's not really going to do that. That's not really who he is. It's all about just winning an election. And I think it really does point to the fact that some people view campaigns as a game and not really a step to true leadership. Trump really surfaced that reality. And when all of a sudden he won, people began to go, what does that mean for me now as a woman? What does that mean for women across the board? Do I have to have a boss like that? All these questions that really many women, when we did focus groups in 2016, just didn't believe someone like that could win and someone like that would be successful. And so what we have seen is a whole new swath of women. That the Women's March really did surface something and led to 2018 women running and winning in huge numbers. That is again true in this year's election cycle, where you had a number of women win, a number of women of color win. In fact, you had quite a few firsts, not as many as 2018, but we are seeing women come into their own, and I think we are going to continue. I know as a campaign, I know the Democratic Party is certainly going to research a heck of a lot more of what we've seen with all the new voters that came online as well. So I know Stefanie can speak more to this, so I'll let my time or give my time over to Stefanie?
I'll allow it, that's fine.
Yeah, I feel like as a Black woman in America, there's this constant feeling that I don't want to assume that race is a determinant of so many aspects of life. I actually went to Howard University, just like our Vice President Kamala Harris went to, partly because I wanted to have a time where I could walk around every day and not have to think about race, to be very honest. But that's not the reality. And so in response to the questions about the married women, and then just also, why did we see this increase in support of President Trump? And let me just say this. There was a three percentage point increase of Black voters that supported Trump this year. That was a surprise. I think actually almost every demographic supported him more than white men, which actually had a 5-point decrease, which is interesting. But there really is something, I think, in this country to white privilege, white supremacy, making sure that, I think at least anecdotally, you will hear, I think a lot of, in my circles, I hear people say, a white woman is going to look to protect her white son and her white husband more than she's going to, which every mom is going to do. But you know what? There does come this sense of humanity, of being all Americans, and of understanding that, we can't have someone in office that literally looks down upon, not just in words, but also in policies, the people of this country. Like, this country is diverse in so many ways. And so I think people were looking at economics. They feel as though their lives didn't get any worse economically under Trump. And so they felt that they were going to continue to go with him. You have, I think a lot of voters were also looking at the misinformation campaign is real. We know that on Facebook, the Trump campaign spent 800 times the amount directly addressing Black men on Facebook than the Biden-Harris campaign did. So imagine what the messaging was that they put out, talking about Biden-Harris not being in support of justice for Black people, talking about the crime bill, talking about Kamala Harris as Attorney General. And so that misinformation campaign was real. It was well funded. I would also say that there's some funding challenges that the Democratic infrastructure has to take into account. The US House barely was won by the Democrats. Republicans picked up 12, they picked up 12 seats in the US House of Representatives. 6 of those seats were held by Democrats, so they flipped them. And so I think ultimately, when you have a case where this historic number of voters turned out to support the Democratic presidential candidate, but yet we don't see that translated on the state level with congressional seats, with people that were running statewide, we have to figure out both, what is the messaging challenges here, and also what is the funding challenges here, because we know that oftentimes candidates of color did not get the necessary support financially from the Democratic infrastructure. That's the DNC, that's the Democratic Senate committees, that's the congressional committees. And so there's a few challenges that we need to address there. But I think until we really have this reckoning with race in this country, we will have a lot of challenges in having Americans come together to heal from these past 4 years and really from these past 400 years in this country.
Okay, fantastic. David, over to you. Joseph, can you unmute David, please?
So look, I suspect that the segmentation in the United States is more granular than we might have here in the UK. I certainly have not seen data on how married women as opposed to single women are voting in quite the same degree at this stage after a general election. But what I'm really interested in is what was happening beyond the cities, as I've said. I mean, I think that our problem here in this country has been in the 2 last general elections. It's quite clear. People in cities are voting for us. Public sector workers are voting for us. And ethnic minorities, with some drop amongst those from South India, are voting for Labour. But we cannot form a government if we are just wedded to that bloc. We have to go beyond that bloc if we want to form a government. And I've always understood that it's not, frankly, the people of Tottenham who will determine whether there is a Labour government. I've heard a lot about the 20% of black men that voted Trump. But I've sort of wondered why people are making so much of that, because in the end, 80% of black men voted for Biden, and 56% of white men voted for Trump. So I think that's a much bigger story. In fact, rather than, I was very interested to hear BBC commentators making such a big deal out of these small numbers of black men that were seduced by Trump. So I think the racial it's sometimes a bit problematic for us to hear this in quite the same way. It's also, I think, important to understand how did the coronavirus affect this election cycle? How did it feel to be old and vulnerable? And someone who could die from this virus when you had a president that seemed not to care. Was that a motivating factor for so many ethnic communities who were dying at a disproportionate rate? It was clear to me that the virus affected this election hugely. It was right in the groove of all commentary about the election, and people voted according to how they felt that the virus was being handled or not. Were you for the lockdown or were you against the lockdown? And of course, there are economic consequences in relation to that. We will not have that here. That will not be the story in 2024. We will have moved past the pandemic. There might be an assessment of how the government handled the pandemic, but it's much more likely that it will be a broader themed economic type election, with culture wars being deployed by the Conservatives and misinformation to push some voters off that economics and, if you like, away from Labour.
Okay, thanks. Oh, sorry, Stefanie.
Yeah, I mean, David brought up extremely important points. And there's this real sense, and if you look at the messaging that the Trump campaign put out, and you tie that even with what's happening around coronavirus. One, to your question, David, about suburban voters, we do know through exit polling that the president's dismal response to the coronavirus epidemic was a motivating factor for them turning out to vote. I think the seriousness of lives being lost constantly was definitely a motivating factor. We did see, however, on the other side, where people felt a sense of a loss of freedom because of the crackdowns. And so it really kind of stands upon where do you ideologically think as it relates to restrictions being put forward? Do you think about it in a way where you're considering the whole, or are you just considering yourself? And so, and I think that's a big challenge we're having with American voters, because, there are people in this country who believe that they will lose their positions in life, their power, their freedom, if other people come into office and other people are able to have a seat at the table. And so that's why you're hearing messages talking about socialism with Biden, Harris, and you're hearing on the other side talk about freedom and make America great again from when? I still don't understand that. Because for so many of us in this country, with the heritage that we have, we haven't had those great times in the past. And so, until we really grapple with the reality that it's about the whole and not about the individuals, that we can focus on policies that unite us, the majorities of Americans are for abortions. And so, the majority of Americans want to have a healthcare system that's affordable. The majority of Americans want to have an education system where all of our children are able to have a quality education. There's so many policies that unite us. The problem is, and I think also to your point, David, that's not often the best soundbite for today. So we will focus on a 20% turnout as opposed to, but wait, the glass is actually more filled than it is empty. Let's focus on, and I'm really hopeful, back to the Amanda's hopeful point, I'm really hopeful that we can have policy conversations, that we can have bipartisan action happen in Congress. I think Tim or Tom asked a question about Georgia voters. So much of what happens with this administration will depend on how the Senate looks. The Senate is determined by what happens with Georgia voters. What happens with Georgia voters depends on what happens with Black and white voters. Let's just be honest. And so how we turn out Black voters, how we message to white voters, how all this stuff happens, how it's being funded. We know right now that Mitch McConnell is dedicating over $80 million just to radio ads in Georgia. I don't even know how TV, I don't even know how you buy that much airtime. $80 million compared to not even half of that amount is being spent currently on the Democratic side. And so what happens in Georgia on January 5th is going to be monumental to how much power Mitch McConnell has, and quite frankly, how much power the Biden-Harris administration has. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So David has to leave early, folks. So just David, is now a good time to jump out, or have you got time for another question?
I'm going to jump out. I wanted to hear Amanda, but thank you so much for joining us. This has been great. Thank you.
No, always welcome. Right, cheers, David. Thank you very much. Right, okay, now David's gone. We're back down now to our international guest stars, who now he's gone, I can say they are the main attraction for this evening. So, but we will go on. Right, so if you hold your breath from what you just finished off saying, Stefanie, I'm going to call in Terry to ask his question on camera. So, Joseph, if you can make sure we can see him. I'll also call in Anne Sassoon, because they've both got questions on a similar theme, going into some the demographic groups in the US and actually what we can learn from the work that's been going on. So, Terry.
Thank you, Nathan. My question is, I have a cousin who lives in Cobb County in Georgia, and I spoke to her motivation about voting. But my question would be, bearing in mind organising minority groups, especially in Georgia, what reflections do you have for the UK audience? And I know you mentioned about some of this political messaging, but perhaps what did you do differently in organisation? Something happened in Georgia, and what happened? And I know it's a US thing, but any reflections for the UK audience? Because there's an issue in attracting the wide diaspora of minorities to vote. Just wondered on your reflections, really.
Cheers, Terry. Then Anne, ask your question.
I'd like to ask about the, I can't see myself, but I'm assuming
You're as resplendent as ever, it's fine.
Thank you very much. This is first to Amanda about, could you say something about the vote in the Latinx populations, and I say that on purpose, given its sort of diversity and also generational aspects. And Nathan, I'm going to be really bold here. Could I? I'd also be interested to know, COVID is obviously extremely important, but COVID is a disease and it's also an economic crisis. So I'm wondering if our speakers could also speak to that, please.
Well, you've asked it now, so I can't say no. I'll take these two, then I've got two more, and then we'll have to finish up, unfortunately. But Amanda, if you could answer Anne's first.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let me my review of COVID, since it's been asked a couple of times. So when you think about campaigns, you think about message, mobilization, money, and momentum. In all four of those categories, COVID really changed the game. So on message, he couldn't get away from COVID, right? And yes, you're right about economic message being important, but the most important thing that really changed things for Trump is he could no longer just talk about economics. He actually had to and was forced to actually deal with how does he actually govern in a pandemic, and obviously he didn't do well there. On mobilization, everything changed, because you no longer had, or at least on the Democratic side, we didn't have a field program. So it completely changed to online. And what I will say about this, particularly in Black and brown communities, we've heard about it, Stephanie's exactly right. The misinformation, the disinformation targeted at Black and brown communities is enormous, and it works. We knew that in 2016, and we saw it work again, in particularly Latino communities. I'll give you one example. Facebook was actually taking down ads of things that were disinformation. They did it in English, not in Spanish. Not to me a surprise that in the Rio Grande Valley, it got through. We know that. We knew that in 2016. So if you don't stop it, it actually does make go through, and it harms mobilization on how people see these candidates. And then the last thing on momentum, COVID really harmed momentum. When he went into, when he got sick, that really did harm an ability to keep a momentum going forward for Trump, and really allowed Biden to have a platform to continue to not only did his message get through, but it proved that taking care of yourself and your community really matters. For a while there, it almost seemed that Trump was walking around doing all the things scientists and doctors weren't saying, and it was working. And so all of a sudden, when he got sick, it really did flip that on its head in a way that really had an effect on momentum. On the field and work that Georgia is seeing, you saw this in Arizona, you saw this in Nevada, it takes years of investment. What Stacey Abrams has done, we've all, everyone has tuned in now, the country and the world has tuned in to see what Stacey Abrams can do in Georgia, but I can't underscore how much time has been spent in Georgia long before we all knew about it. The community engagement, going to where the community is, being there for the long haul matters. Black and brown communities in America have often been the very last sort of target at the very end of a campaign to get them excited. That's not how you truly build community engagement and community empowerment. It's about a relationship. Stacey Abrams did that in Arizona. A lot of immigrant groups have been doing that for some time. And that's what now we see a decade later, you're actually seeing folks come out, become engaged, and really now that's what's happening in Georgia. Will it have been enough? Will it have been long enough and a long enough investment? We're going to see come January. The Latino population. One of the things I've said about this election is this is going to be, I think, the election where people got to know the Latino community in a real way. The diverse richness of it, the fact that Latinos in California are different than rural Latinos in Texas, are different than Cubans in Miami. The other aspect that's quite different is, did you grow up in a place like Miami where everything's done in Spanish? You can negotiate in Spanish. Right? It's a very different lived experience when you are growing up in Miami than when you're growing up as a Puerto Riqueño in Wisconsin. And so pollsters, Democratic Party, I'd say the Republican Party actually has figured out how to divide or understand the different aspects of the community, particularly in Florida. The Democratic Party has a long way to go to understand the different levers of the Latino community. And one I will state that is most obvious to me and was most obvious in this election is how important the economic message is. Bernie used it in economic inequality and it really hit the Latino community. Trump used it in economic agenda, more speaking to the business community, and a swath of that worked for quite a few people. So there's a lot of work to be done here, but it's really important to note that we are seeing some of the same trends that you are seeing in mainstream. The rural city divide, the generational divide. And so in some ways we do sit in between what I think people have viewed Latinos as, like of course they're going to be Democrats, to really understanding they are subject to the same sort of geographical influences, particularly when you layer on the micro-targeting with disinformation that they have now received. And there's no doubt to me, having grown up in rural America and seen those ads, that micro-targeting is quite effective in rural America because these Facebook groups, these social groups, Parler Now, spreads like wildfire, and it sticks. It sticks in a way that we aren't necessarily seeing in more city environments where you have exposure to a lot more messages. And so that's something that I think we're going to have to really contend with as we think about America and politics in the future. Thanks so much for all those questions.
Okay, no, thank you. That was amazing. All right, Stefanie, over to you.
Yeah, Amanda really touched upon the key points. You know, I would add that, especially as we look at looking back and looking forward with regards to Georgia, Terry, I think every Black person, at least in America, maybe globally, has a cousin in Georgia. Georgia just happens to be one of those states where everybody knows somebody in Georgia. And so they've had an extreme influx of voters from around the country, Black voters from around the country, who have oftentimes a more progressive lens on some policy prescriptions. But it also is one of those places that is vastly different because you have Atlanta and then you almost have everywhere else. So you have this urban center, but you have extreme rural areas. And, you know, I'm thinking about the question regarding COVID. You know, Black and Latino people in this country are oftentimes the frontline workers. They're working at the grocery stores. They're working at the gas stations. You know, they're having the most interactions with people. We know that when it comes to income inequality, we were already suffering there. But with COVID, you know, we are now seeing Black and Latino people primarily are the ones who are losing their jobs. And so as far as the organizing tactics there, not just around messaging, and I love the 4 M's that Amanda laid out, we saw that there were organizations who had been on the ground for a long time also switching up tactics. You had groups like Georgia Stand Up, which has been organizing throughout the state of Georgia, and included in their organizing, providing PPEs for people who couldn't afford masks, who couldn't afford what they needed to stay safe from COVID. They were providing access to COVID testing. They were providing food. We saw a number of organizations, not just in Georgia, but around the country, who had food drives the food availability in addition to come register to vote. in this current climate, that was extremely important. You got people out who typically were not reached because, one of the problems we have in democratic politics is a lot of organizing happens with who has voted before. And so establishment democratic organizations tend to only focus on those who have a voting record, whereas we saw grassroots organizations who have been mobilizing in the communities for years, targeting people. And I know my organization, the Collective Pact, did this. We targeted no investment voters. So those are the voters who didn't vote in 16, they probably didn't vote in 18 either, to reach out to them specifically with a message that would help mobilize them to the polls. And so finally, I just want to say, I don't want to underestimate that we saw a ground game, we saw an airwaves game, we saw a digital game. My organization alone spent almost $2 million just on radio ads. We spent $6 million on digital ads, just targeting those non-investment Black voters who have felt left out. But also, people were able to get resourced early. And to Amanda's point, very rarely do we have community groups of color get money prior to September of an election year. I can say that a lot of groups had money by February. So we had money to plan. We had money to have organizers in place, and quite frankly, had a comfort system in knowing your entire team will probably be remote. I have not met most of my staff this year, which is like in person. But having the money to hire staff to be able to have operations ongoing was, I think, a crucial element that hasn't been talked about enough and needs to be part of the political process moving forward, to have these community groups that have those closest connections and ties to the people on the ground, be resourced early, often, is going to be vitally important moving forward.
Right, I agree with all of that. And the amount of elections I've been out knocking on doors and realising that you're talking to people you've not spoken to for 20 years. And it's a bit like, yeah, they didn't vote then. I'm not quite sure why we're going back 20 years down the line. Right, quickly, we've got to finish at 10:02. So there are three of you who've got similar questions. And it's along this theme of actually Biden and Harris have won now. The whole point of actually the future for America is coming together as one nation. So the next three questions have all got an aspect of that. And if you, like I said, be quick. So I've got Tim Galsworthy, I've got Holly Barrow, and then to finish up with Liam Martin Lane. So, and then ladies, just your front lobal reflections on what they've had to say. Then we can go home, and Stefanie can wake her children up from their afternoon nap.
Hi, all. This has been really great. Thanks so much. I just have a question, really, of how you think or hope Biden-Harris will approach the Republican Party, because I think we're going to see two directions. We're going to see kind of the bare minimum Republicans who accept that Biden is president versus kind of embittered, the Trumpite wing of the Republican Party who are never going to accept it. And what should Biden do? Should Biden and Harris and the Democrats reach across the aisle? Or should it be a case of you've not reached across the aisle for 4 years, you've moved away from us, what's the point? And I think if Labour can learn anything from Joe Biden, it's ignore Twitter. Ignore Labour Twitter and Keir Starmer will do well. I think that's what Labour can learn from Joe Biden.
I'm going to cancel your account tomorrow then, Tim. Thank you very much for that. Holly, over to you.
What influence do you think the progressive members of the Democrats like AOC and the Squad and like Bernie Sanders and stuff will have on Biden and his policy agenda? Do you think it'll be as progressive as Trump and other Republicans kind of made it out to be and portrayed it as during the campaign?
Lastly, Liam.
Thank you to the panel, some fantastic contributions. Stefanie, you touched on the success of the Biden-Harris ticket, but then, of course, the Democrats losing seats in the House. The best we can do is manage 50 seats in the Senate. So looking to the 2022 midterms, positive but mixed results here. What would an effective campaign look like, particularly in states such as Ohio, Iowa, Florida, states which voted twice for Obama but have swung fairly firmly for Trump in this election by like 5 to 8 points?
There you go. All I would like to say here, just from a terminological point of view, folks, Amanda and Stefanie, by progressive, Amanda and Stefanie mean the whatever side it is, the left wing of the Democrats whereas us on this call, most of us would call ourselves progressives. So basically, we're more like the moderates as opposed to the quad. Anyway, over to you. Amanda, you go first.
Good. Thank you. Thanks for the questions again. I love all of this engagement. It's wonderful. Biden-Harris and how to deal with Republicans. Listen, Biden has from the very beginning said, I am a president for all Americans. He has to stay on that message, but at the end of the day, having served or having worked in the Senate as a chief of staff for 9 years, he's going to be counting the votes. Because in order to actually get your policy to pass, you need X votes, period, the end. So in that vein, you will see splits. You already are, right? You're seeing Mitt Romney move off. And so he's going to start Ben Sass. So you will see him in short order, and you're seeing it already now, is really work with those members, those senators, who he really has a chance at reaching over and grabbing some of those votes. I think that group will get larger as you have more presidential candidates who are trying to figure out how to make headlines, how to get engaged, and how to prove that they did something. I think we will move a little bit more back. Now, again, who knows where Trump falls into all of this, because if he's back in the race, that changes the dynamics a little bit. But at the end of the day, you got to get to the votes, and he's going to see how he can do that. I do think it's why in the first year, 2 years, most of the administration's focus is going to be on executive, what he can do in the executive branch and in agencies themselves, and it needs to be. I can't express enough how much damage and undoing this president has done in the work that we can't see in the executive branch and the agencies themselves. It's why it's been so important for him to name people who understand how these agencies work so that we can get it back to a foundation where you can move forward from there. That, of course, is what makes the conversations a little bit more difficult with Squad or some of the progressives who want to really push the country to that next level. I think what you will see and what you will start to see shape in short order is more of a discussion of how do we get there? How do we put some seeds in right now so that we can actually get to really targeted, ambitious goals on climate change, specifically on immigration and on racial equity. Those are 3 of the 4 pillars he's already named. I think, though, there's a reality that it is difficult to go through the legislative process right now, and that's going to take a mean in the first quarter of 2021.
Right. Okay. And Stefanie, closing answers and closing thoughts over to you.
Yeah, you know what? So part of my my background is I support Black candidates running for office across the country. And to your question, Liam, I think we need to double down on candidates of color and double down on women candidates for the midterm elections. We are going to see a swarm come from the Republican Party when it comes to putting up candidates that are highly conservative. We saw the backlash that happened after Barack Obama was elected in 2008. What happened in the 2010 midterms. I think we can anticipate that there's going to be a lot of money being put forward. And so we have to be prepared to have candidates who are ready to run in these congressional races, similar to what we saw in 2018. And when we see candidates of color on the ballot, it increases voter turnout with people of color and with young people. And so for the states that you mentioned, like Ohio, which is actually my home state, we saw a candidate like Desiree Timms who was prone to win her race. It was a more conservative district. However, the amount of funding that she received, not just from the party infrastructure, but just overall, she wasn't competitive in the way that she needed to be. And so we have to, I think, have a doubling down on support for these candidates to help them be able to win. And I think that's one way that we'll be able to have a more successful midterm election than even what we saw in this presidential year.
Okay, and with that, unfortunately, folks, that's all, folks. We could have gone on all night, and I think if you looked at the note we prepared for Amanda and for Stefanie and for David, we barely touched the first bullet point or 2. So I don't know, maybe next year a crucial point would be fantastic to have both of you back, and we could do this again and have a proper conversation about actually what that progressive relationship needs to look like across the Atlantic, and from both of your perspectives. Like I said privately in our chat earlier on, we've got miles to go until we're anywhere close to being close to Democrats in terms of our Black and Asian minority representation in the Labour Party. So basically, we're all ears in what you've got to say. But at that note, so Amanda Renteria to Stefanie Brown-James, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been fantastic. So great stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Great stuff. Thank you. Just to say for everyone else, next Tuesday, I think it's next Tuesday, we haven't announced it yet, but next Tuesday we've got a meeting with Andy Burnham and with a couple of other guests, looking at where do we go now with the Northern Powerhouse, and actually post-COVID and post-Brexit, how can we as a Labour Party turbocharge that agenda and actually ensure that that levelling up agenda is a Labour agenda, quite frankly, and not something that Boris is trying to push through in his own sort of Trumpian fashion. So those notices will be going out tomorrow. It's just another one, actually. Thanks very much for joining us this week and a fortnight ago. So Progress and Policy Network are likely to be setting out a proper programme of events like this for 2021. So here's your little bit of market testing. If for the next couple of weeks, or week or two, if any of you have got any suggestions or any ideas of stuff you'd like us to cover, and bearing in mind as we're doing a policy network, this will be at the highfalutin end of the work we do. So it's more high-minded visionary stuff, none of your down and dirty in the gutter political nonsense. Please give one of us an email, and we'll see what we can do. And ideally, I'll try and bring political nonsense and high-minded matter in an hour at the same time. You can just look at my books. I'll talk the normal nonsense. Anyway, that's it. So thanks very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure tonight. Have a good week. And stay safe, those of you in England still. All right, cheerio.